Hello, welcome back to my channel. Last night I started this book and I'm loving it. I heard that the new hardback edition that got published by an actual publishing agency is different from this edition. The story is actually a little bit different. And I know that in order to move on to the sequel, I'm gonna need to read that version so I kind of understand what's going on. So I decided I'm gonna go to the store and I'm gonna read both of these and I'm gonna try and figure out what the differences are. The Atlas 6 and I plan on getting one more of these books. I'll show you which one it is when I open them. But as I was walking through, I realized that there were 2 more books on the shelves out that I didn't realize were out that I've been wanting to get as soon as they came out. So I picked them up. The Atlas 6, which I wanted to do, is really funny. Online, they had it priced as $20 and in store it's $25. There's going to be a little bit more illustrations in it. I don't think any of them are in color, like in some of the Illumicrate and Fairy Loot boxes. There are some colored illustrations. Oh, they're different illustrations. So this is, first off, a huge difference. So this is the first illustration, which I'm pretty sure this is Libby. This is what I have. The pink is me. I decided to color in all of the pictures when I got to them. I'm probably not going to do it with the other edition. From looking at the chapter titles, it looks to me that all of these are exactly the same. It doesn't tell me how many page numbers each of them are, so I can't be sure. First book is 380 pages. This one is 373, but their size is just about the same. This one, the margins on the pages are not much at all. You don't have much room here on the sides at the bottom. It goes directly to all corners. I have to have the book all the way open in order to read it. This edition is pretty similar, but I would say it has slightly more margins. And this text is, I would say, kind of small for a normal book, but about average. And this is probably about the same, although I think the leading is a little bit bigger in this. So the space between lines, I think, is bigger in this edition than it is in this. In a Garden Burning Gold, this is the other book that I knew I was going to be picking up when I was in the store. And then finally, I picked up Scorpica. Anyways, I saw this on someone else's shelf because they got an arc of it and I instantly knew I had to buy it. Interesting stack here. I have 10 more minutes on my lunch break, so I'm gonna read and then I'm gonna go back to work. It's been a few days, honestly been longer than I meant to take while reading this book, but life's been kind of crazy. But I have officially finished the Atlas 6, the first and older edition. And guys, I loved it. I loved it so much that I'm contemplating putting it in my top 3, which means that I have to remove either the Starless Sea, Vicious, or Warbreaker from my top 3, because those are my top 3 right now. And I'm considering removing Warbreaker. I cannot put a book into my favorites of all time until I've at least read it a few times. So it can't go there yet, but I'm about to reread it. I'm about to pick up the second copy and reread it. It's set in a very realistic world to ours, except that some people have these superhuman magical abilities and they fall into a few different categories. There are lots of different types. They haven't all been even understood or explained yet. And we are following 6 college students aged around 20 years of age, and they have been confronted by this man at the very beginning of the book called Atlas, and he wants them to join this secret society that has all of the hidden, destroyed, forbidden knowledge through all of mankind. And so they will have 1 year where they get to study and read and practice their magic and get as strong as they possibly can. And at the end of that year, somehow 5 of them will be chosen to continue on and 1 of them will be chosen not to. And it's not even so much of like you're trying to prove yourself in that year. It's more of like you're just trying to learn as much as possible and grow stronger and figure out how you can best work in a team, because it's all about the 5 who are going to continue on in this group working as a team together. And I just really enjoyed, you get each of the 6 characters POVs, so you really get to break them down and see how they think. And I liked seeing how each of them reacted to different scenarios and different things that were happening. I liked seeing all of their magic and how it unfolded and was developed. Some of them, like, you didn't even fully understand exactly what they could do until near the end of the book. I loved their interactions. I loved seeing how things changed from POV to POV. Really enjoyed the writing. I think Olivia Blake did such a good job. It's definitely a little bit more complex and harder than I would normally enjoy, but I think she did just such a good job with it. And I had like a few examples, but I don't remember any of them off the top of my head. I am really excited to continue on and read the next one. Morning, happy Sunday. I am about to go on my morning walk, but I wanted to update you guys on some of the differences I've already noticed between these 2 copies. I officially made it through the first section of the new edition, which is called Weapons, and I'm about to start Truth. I have noticed some differences. I'm really close to page 50. Nothing super dramatic. I think that the changes that they made were to help build this story in a better way. Personally, so far, I've liked the mystery of this, but I think storytelling wise, this did a better job. What's really been changing, besides like a few word choices here and there, slight word changes, they do not change the meaning of anything. There have been a couple of plot point changes. So really what's been happening though, every single one of the plot points that has changed is we are getting information about our characters way earlier in the story. There's a couple of things, specifically I think it was about Libby. I know we learned about her sister and her parents on page 10. You don't learn about her sister in this edition until page 300, possibly even later. It's much later in the book. I think it was a good choice because that's her whole entire drive, and you don't learn about that part of her until much, much later in the book. And then you learn stuff about Rena and her parents, which you do not learn until very near the end of the first edition as well. And then you learn a little bit about Tristan's father and the relationship between the 2 of them. Very brief. It's almost like just one extra sentence. And to be honest, the sentence doesn't even call out his father. It calls out someone in his life that is interacting with Tristan in a certain way. As I've read the whole entire first edition, I know who that person is. Like I said, I think that these changes were really so that we could understand these characters a little bit quicker, know more about them. The whole entire mystery of this book is not to learn about who these characters are. It's about the Atlas 6 and like the program and what's going on and who's going to be the one person who doesn't make it. So it didn't totally make sense to keep some of these secrets from the reader for the entire time. But I also kind of liked the mystery of the first book. And to be fair, they haven't like gone in depth about the 3 things that we have learned about these characters at all. You're just kind of getting like a baseline understanding of like Libby has a sister. We don't know where she is. Rena has a father, we don't know where he is, and Tristan has someone in his life who is not treating him well. Finished the section called Truth, and I'm about to enter the section called Battle. I just realized I'm using yellow tabs to mark all of the differences, so when I hold the book up for you all, you can't see a single thing. That's rather unfortunate because in that last section there were actually quite a few changes. Nothing that changes the importance of the story or like what's taking place, but almost all of the changes were either for Gideon, Max, or Ezra. So what I'm noticing is a lot of the changes have to do with building up the secondary characters into just a more well fleshed out. We actually understand what they look like because in the other book, we don't even get a description of Gideon or Max. And then we also get like a little bit more of a backstory for both of them. It's not even like more information necessarily about Ezra. It's the way that Libby describes him has changed in this edition from the first edition. So she is much more focused on his physical appearance and less focused on what he's doing, which I think is such an interesting shift, to be honest. So in the first edition, there's this scene where they're having dinner together and she's telling him for the first time that she's going to go off and join this society. And she is very focused on like his hands touching the wine glass and like how his movements are in the scene. Whereas in this edition, she is very, very focused on his hair and how tousled it is and how messy he looks and how his skin is looking. And it's just like a really interesting take on this new character, especially now that I know a lot more about Ezra as I have finished the book. So I'm really enjoying some of the changes because I feel like it's opening up the world a little bit more for me and I'm better able to understand some of the characters. Will still so far agree that I prefer edition 1 because I like that mystery and I like not knowing and I liked the puzzling of things together. But I also understand, once again, how this would be much more accessible for more people and how this makes much more sense in the course of how novels are generally written. Okay, so I finished the next section, which is called Battle. And I want to say before I tell you some of the differences that I enjoyed it so much more the second time. And to be honest, like I enjoyed it the first time. I thought it was a really good section. It's when you first start to see action in the book. But upon second read, now that I know specifically what Callum was doing during this scene, because you don't learn about it until much later on in the book, but also like what some of our other characters are doing and what this will lead to for them, it was such an enjoyable read. So good. Now that I've said that, there were some differences in this section, which I thought were probably the biggest differences I've seen so far. And I want to talk about them briefly because they didn't change like the plot of the book or the meaning of the story or really like anything to do with the book, but they took away a couple of Callum's lines and I don't totally know why, because definitely in the second edition, it's making him much less awful. The lines that they took away from him, they were very like mean things to say, and it was kind of like thoughts he had to himself, so it was already like internalized thoughts that he was having. Specifically, he has thoughts like against poor people, and I'm not sure why they took them away from him because he's supposed to be detested, and I don't think that with removing some of those lines it's as effective. So they had some of his thoughts change specifically around gender. He kind of has this thought in the first edition about how and I actually highlighted the quote because I thought it was really beautifully written even if I don't necessarily agree with it. So his exact thought in the first edition was, it was a very feminine thing to be both magical and saintly. Philanthropy could be worn like jewelry or cosmetics, glittering from the effervescence of their pores. And it was kind of Callum talking about how most people with his ability are women and how women are more likely to do the right thing. Like I said, I don't necessarily agree, but we're seeing Callum's point of view, and I thought that that really built up his character. Now, in the second edition, the exact line goes, it was a very feminine thing to do, to be both magical and saintly. Callum would blame the false dichotomy of gender constructs if only he had the time. And so we're kind of taking away this idea that like Callum is an active person who's making decisions in his life into a very self-centered person, which is true. And you do know that he is very self-centered in the book in the first edition as well. There was another quote that they completely removed from the second edition, and I want to read what it actually says in the first edition because it was one of my favorite lines from the book. So they left the paragraph exactly the same. If you're reading the second edition, it's on page 72, and it starts with a self-perpetuating cycle, really, that knowledge begets knowledge just as power begets power. Now, in the first edition, the actual first sentence of that paragraph is, there was a reason knowledge was reserved for the elite. And I think that that also helps understand Callum's backstory and understands how horrible of a person he is, that he could truly believe that knowledge should be saved for certain people and not for others. I mean, that's a theme going throughout the entire story, but I liked that in edition 1 we got to see that Callum agrees with that theme, whereas in this edition it's not quite as obvious. Another thing that happened in edition 2 that didn't happen in edition 1 is multiple times in this section they described the house that we are in, and we got some description in the first edition, but it went into so much more detail. There were paragraphs upon paragraphs, not all back to back, but throughout this section where we learn what the house looks like that we did not know previously. And I think that was interesting because I definitely did not have a grasp of what this house looked like, and now I do. And so that was really nice of the author, the publisher, whomever, to come and fix that so that I could visually see things a little bit better. We also get a little bit more of Rena and what she thinks of Parisa in this section, specifically that Rena will not allow herself to be misused in the way that Parisa wants to misuse people in her life, and she connects that back to her backstory, which in edition 1 we wouldn't have known anything about her backstory yet, but as of this edition we know like some small tidbits, not that much to be honest. We also do get a little bit more of Gideon in this section. We learn a little bit more about his history, a little bit more about the magic he can use, and a little bit more about his mother and how she uses magic, which is something that is not explained at all in edition 1. So if you felt at all confused about Gideon's mom, which I did, this helps a lot by explaining what she's doing and how she's kind of thinking. The final thing that this section informs us of that the first edition did not is that Nico, well, we knew a lot about Nico, but we learn just how good he is at his gift, and we get to see that in the first edition, but in this one we get to have it explained just a little bit more. There's a whole entire paragraph talking about like how many different competitions he's won and stuff. Okay, so I should probably turn that sound off. I just finished space, so I'm about to enter time now, and there weren't a ton of differences in that section. It was funny, in Callum's chapter there were actually no differences whatsoever, and I say it's funny because the section before his chapter had so many differences. The main section where we get differences is with Nico. We learn a lot more about Gideon, or Gideon's mom is kind of explained in just like a more understanding of a way. It's not necessarily more information, it's just better explained to us. But one thing that did happen was in Rena's chapter, we lost one of my favorite lines again. Talking to Parisa, this line is still in the book. It says, "Of course Parisa was plotting something. She wasn't a woman the same way Rena was a woman, or the same way Libby was." The part that she took out of the book is, "She was a woman in the weaponized sense, the kind who could step on others to keep herself at the top. And from the looks of it, she was having no trouble getting what she wanted." And I just really like that line because I feel like it really describes Parisa, and it, you know, she takes no shit. And I also really love the idea of like she was a woman in the way of a weapon. Okay, so I just did the sections time and thought back to back because almost nothing changed between the two different versions. There were like very minimal word changes, or like a sentence would get swapped with another sentence, but like they would have the same two sentences, they would just be in different order from each other, except near the end of thought, the section where Nico talks about Gideon to Parisa is a little bit different near the end. The way he thinks about Gideon, what he tells her, what she finds out, all of that changes very slightly. It's just kind of, it's the same information, but the way it's told is just done more concise and quicker. And a lot of what you've already learned about Gideon's mom this is where you learn about it in the first edition. So you don't need that in the second edition. I finished both editions of the Atlas 6. 5 out of 5 for both editions. I loved both of these so much. Let's talk about the changes at the end of the book, and then let's talk about which edition I think you should read / what I liked about both editions as a complete whole work. So the second to last section was called Intent, and there were almost no differences between the two editions. I think the only differences came down to like slight word choice. For the last section, Death, a heck of a lot changed. Like a lot of the story changed. This is where a majority of the changes took place. I did tab, and you can see the yellow a little bit more, but near the end I actually stopped tabbing the changes because it was quite literally every single paragraph was different from the first edition. With no spoilers, I will talk about it, and then I will talk about it with spoilers, and I will kind of mark it for you all so you know if you don't want to hear the spoilers, so that you can still understand which edition you should read. Basically, the 3 chapters that changed at the end, there are 3 characters, Tristan, Parisa, and then the last character marked chapter, I will not tell you who it is, are very different. What it kind of boils down to is there's this scene where everyone sees something happen, but because Tristan can see through illusions in the first edition, he doesn't see the event happening, but everyone else does. In this edition, Tristan can see what's happening because the illusion is done in such a different way that he wouldn't be able to necessarily see through it. So he can see also what is happening, but because he can see through illusions, he is the first person to bring it forward that it is an illusion to everyone else. Parisa's chapter changes because there is this moment where Dalton comes and tells everyone about something that's really important to him. And in this edition, Atlas interrupts before he's about to do that. So Dalton doesn't tell everyone the information, but Parisa tracks him down later in the chapter and she finds out about that information. So something that's very important there, only Parisa knows. As for the last chapter, the chapter of which I will not be naming the character who is having said chapter, a lot changes. Their whole entire backstory is just done in a very different way, and I really liked it because the ending changing, the backstory changing for them made it so that they were more intentful with what they were doing and less being just a bystander of what was happening. The whole entire ending with Libby doing her thing is still the same. The whole entire ending with all of the different characters, who's getting chosen, who's getting picked, all of that is absolutely the same. You could go into, I'm assuming, the Atlas Paradox after having read this edition and still make the most of it. The main difference is going to be there are going to be characters who do or don't know information that you think they should know, because in this book it happens to them, but in this book it doesn't, or it does. That could get a little bit confusing going into it. If you are in the mindset that you don't want to read this whole entire new book, but you want to continue on to the sequel, I highly recommend getting online maybe just a copy of Death and just reading that. It's about 60 pages. If you're not wanting to read that, literally read the 3 chapters that I suggested, and that will explain pretty much all of the big changes that you need to know between these 2 books. Spoiler time, really quickly. If you know how it ends, then you know that at the end, Ezra kills Libby and leaves an illusion of her body. In the first edition, Tristan cannot see the body at all because it is an animated corpse. It is an illusion. In this edition, he is able to see the corpse, but is able to see that it's not Libby. And then Dalton tells everyone in the first edition that he can animate objects, including beings. In the second edition, he doesn't tell everyone that. Only Parisa knows that information. And in the first edition, Ezra learns that he can time travel basically with his mom's death, and he watches her get shot 12 times in a row because he is stuck in a time loop going through his grief. And then he basically loses years of his life because he's trying to figure out how to use his ability, eventually teams up with Atlas, and they are working towards a better future for mankind and are bringing all of these people together, and that is why they have the Atlas 6. In the new edition, Ezra's ability still manifests when he watches his mom get shot, but then he continues living his life forward in time to eventually, once he thinks he can control things and make a difference, goes back and purposely relives those shootings 12 times to try and fix his mother from getting shot. And then he continues forward, realizes he can't change something that drastic, and then he meets up. He becomes one of the 6 during Atlas's years, and him and Atlas decide to move forward with their decisions. While Atlas is collecting his 6, and then eventually Ezra is living out his life at college and meeting some of the 6 and trying to form them together, Atlas definitely is more actively moving against Ezra in the second edition, whereas in the first one, it's evident that he is not agreeing with Ezra anymore and that they might be butting heads, but In this edition, there are no questions asked that Atlas wants to get rid of Callum, wants to get rid of Parisa, and wants to get rid of Ezra, and is making active plans against them, and that Ezra is starting to make active plans against Atlas. And I think that's what we're going to be seeing a lot more in book 2. Now that spoilers are done, let's talk about which edition I think you should read. So up until Death, I would have said this edition. I like how she wrote in this edition. I liked how it didn't feel so much like other books. I liked the uniqueness of it, and I liked struggling to understand and struggling to figure things out and struggling to piece things together. This edition definitely served up some backstory, served up some explanation in a much easier and more digestible way, which I think is perfectly fine and I think is an absolutely good and fantastic read. But after having read the last few chapters, the section called Death was done so much better in this one. It was so much more easy to understand everyone's motives and how they got to where they were and what they were doing. And I really liked not having everyone know all of the information that everyone else knew at the end, because it means that in book 2, there are going to be things withheld from people and there's going to be some misunderstandings, and we're just going to have this great wealth of knowledge put onto a few different people and then have these soldiers working for them. I would say if you can only read one of the editions, if you haven't read one yet, you should read the Tor published edition. Also, that'll be great because this is much easier to get your hands on now than the first edition is. If you have read the first edition, like I said, make your own decision about whether or not you want to read this edition, or you can just watch the spoiler section of this video and you don't really need to read this edition at all. I do highly recommend reading this edition. It was great and it was really fun. You learn a lot more about side characters' backstories, what the world looks like, and how certain magic is used. And then again, you have the whole entire changes with the ending. But overall, I don't think it's necessary to read this edition to go into the Atlas Paradox. To be fair, the Atlas Paradox has not been published at the moment of me filming this video, so I cannot say for sure. But I think that if you went into it only having read this, you're not going to be lost, you're going to be fine, everything will make sense, you'll move on. That is my summary and evaluation of the Atlas 6. I hope you all enjoyed this. I don't know if I will ever do this again, to be honest. It took a lot of energy out of me to read a book back to back. I hope you are all having a good time. Let me know down below what you thought of the Atlas 6. I am definitely considering putting it on my favorites, top 3 favorites of all time list. I hope the Atlas Paradox is just as good. I'm so psyched for that book to be coming out. I believe it's later this year. I appreciate each and every one of you. I don't remember how my outro goes, but until next time, I will talk to you in the comments. Bye!